4 little girls sat frozen in the snow, no names, no voices until a broken man stopped, looked at them and said, "Come home." He wasn't looking to be a father again, not after everything he'd lost. Nathan Brooks, a once powerful man, known for silence more than sympathy, returned to the quiet town of Briar Hollow with a single goal: sell the empty house he could no longer bear to enter and disappear into a life where no one remembered his name. But fate doesn't ask for permission. That day, with snow clinging to his coat and grief curling in his chest like smoke, he saw them 4 little girls huddled on a park bench, their eyes hollow, their hands clutched together like lifelines. No adults, no voices, just stillness. Something inside Nathan cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the slow, painful certainty of a man remembering what it meant to care. He didn't know their names. They didn't know his. But in the space between silence and survival, something passed between them, a recognition, a plea, maybe a dare. That moment, unremarkable to everyone else, would become the start of a story neither the girls nor Nathan were meant to forget. Not because they were family by blood, but because they chose to stay. The wind cut through Nathan Brooks' coat like a blade as he stepped out of his rental car and onto the frost-bitten gravel of Briar Hollow's main street. It had been 15 years since he last set foot in this town, and it hadn't changed. Not the sagging wooden storefronts, not the crooked stop sign near McKinley's diner, not even the scent of pine and chimney smoke drifting through the cold. He hadn't planned to stay long. This was just business sell. The old house, finalize the paperwork, disappear. But the moment his boots hit the snow-crusted sidewalk, the weight of memory wrapped around his chest like chains. He could still see Grace standing on that porch laughing at something he'd mumbled under his breath, Lily running barefoot through the grass, her giggles echoing in the summer air. That house, now empty, sat like a ghost, waiting to be exorcised. Nathan clenched his jaw. He wasn't here to feel. He wasn't here to remember. He had built an empire on silent, survived grief by sealing every crack where emotion might leak through. And yet every creak of wood beneath his steps, every flake of snow melting on his cheek seemed to whisper her name. Lily, the daughter he couldn't save, the child he had buried too soon. He moved like a man on autopilot, keys in one hand, a manila folder in the other, not realizing he'd stopped in front of the hardware store until a familiar face stepped out. Mr. Haywood, older now, beard, silvered eyes narrowed with quiet recognition. Nathan gave a tight nod and walked on, unwilling to explain, unwilling to be remembered. He passed the church, the shuttered post office, the faded playground where Lily had scraped her knees. And by the time he reached the edge of Carter Park, dusk had begun to fall. He was about to turn back when something stopped him. Something small, unmoving, barely visible on the bench ahead. 4 little girls. No coats, no shoes, just silence. Nathan Brooks had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind. Unlock the front door, walk through the house without flinching, sign the sale papers, and vanish before the past could catch up with him. But as he stood before the weather-worn white house at the end of Sycamore Lane, his hands refused to move. The key hung heavy from his fingers, colder than the winter air pressing against his back. This house, once filled with music and laughter, now stared at him with hollow windows, like eyes that had seen too much and remembered everything. He had told himself he was only here to sell it. Let go of the ghosts. Cut the last thread connecting him to a life that no longer existed. Grace had died in this town. Lily had taken her final breath here. And no amount of time, no empire of steel and stock and silence he had built since could bury the sound of their absence. The real estate agent had been patient, said buyers were interested if he could just come sign in person. He had agreed not because he wanted closure, but because he wanted escape. He couldn't keep driving past the edges of this memory forever. He needed to sever it clean, pack up what was left in boxes, and lock the door behind him one final time. Yet as he stepped over the threshold, the warmth of old air greeted him like an unwelcome hug. The hallway still smelled faintly of vanilla and cedar, her favorite candle. The sofa still bore the faint indentation where Lily used to curl up with a blanket too big for her tiny frame. The dining table still held a small water stain from a glass he never got around to fixing. Every object screamed of them. He dropped the folder on the counter, heart-racing knuckles white against the edge of the granite. This wasn't supposed to hurt anymore. He had trained himself to move on, to become someone untouchable. But this house, their house, refused to forget. And part of him feared that if he left now, truly left, it wouldn't just be them he was abandoning. It would be himself. He hadn't meant to stop at the park. His plan was to leave the folder on the kitchen counter, maybe call the agent, maybe not, and drive until the road forgot his name. But something about the quiet, the biting cold pressing into his bones, had pulled him toward Carter Park like a current he couldn't fight. The old bench beneath the maple tree was still there, worn, but standing just like he remembered. Nathan sat slowly, exhaling a plume of breath that faded into the crisp air. He hadn't sat here in years. Not since Lily's last birthday, when Grace had packed sandwiches and they'd spent the afternoon laughing as autumn leaves fell like golden confetti. Now the bench was silent, the playground rusted, and still the sun dipping low behind the hills. He might have closed his eyes for a second, might have let the numbness slip over him like snow. But when he opened them, everything changed. Across the narrow path, barely 10 feet away, sat 4 little girls on the opposite bench, huddled together. No coats, no mittens, just thin, torn sweaters clinging to their small frames and bare feet planted against the icy concrete. Their eyes weren't crying. Crying would have meant someone was coming. Their eyes were blank, hollow, like windows in an abandoned home. Nathan's breath caught heart stuttering in a way he hadn't felt since the hospital. The oldest girl couldn't have been more than 9. The smallest looked barely 4. They didn't speak. Didn't shiver. They just sat, arms wrapped around each other like lifelines, skin raw with cold, their presence so still it felt unnatural. Forgotten, as if the world had paused and left them behind. For a moment, Nathan wondered if they were real, if grief had finally broken something in his mind. But then the littlest one blinked, slowly, and the oldest shifted subtly, pushing the younger ones closer to her side. It wasn't imagination. It was survival. And for the first time in years, Nathan Brooks stood without knowing why, only that something inside him said, "Don't look away." Nathan didn't know that the moment he stepped off that bench and walked toward the girls, everything he believed about his life was about to unravel. He didn't know that what began as a quiet gesture, a jacket draped over shivering shoulders, a single question asked with trembling voice, would pull him into a storm more powerful than grief or guilt. All he knew was that something inside him, buried for years beneath layers of steel and silence, had stirred. As he crouched beside the bench and met the eyes of the oldest girl, dark-guarded, unblinking, he felt it, a shift imperceptible but undeniable, like the ground beneath his feet had cracked open and was offering him a path he didn't understand but couldn't ignore. He didn't know their names, didn't know where they came from, or what had brought them to this frozen town, to that cold bench wearing clothes that looked like they hadn't been changed in weeks. He didn't know why no one else had seen them, why no one else had stopped. But he knew this: if he walked away now, he wouldn't be able to live with himself. Something about their stillness mirrored his own. Something about their silence screamed in the same pitch as his loss. And so he stayed. He asked if they were okay. They didn't answer. He offered food. The youngest reached out, first hesitant, trembling fingers touching his, like he might disappear if she blinked. He didn't know that moment would be the beginning of a story, larger than any business deal, larger than the company he'd spent a lifetime building, larger even than the grief he thought had already written his ending. He didn't know he was about to find family in the most broken place of his soul. That these 4 girls, silent, hidden, abandoned, would become the ones to teach him how to stay, how to love again, and how to fight for something more powerful than redemption, belonging. At Briar Hollow General Hospital, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as Nathan sat outside the pediatric observation room, his coat still dusted with snow, heart pounding from everything that had unfolded over the past 2 hours. The 4 girls were inside, huddled together on a single hospital bed like a tangle of fragile limbs and frightened hearts. Nurses had tried gently, even kindly, to separate them for examination, but the girls had clung to one another with the silent desperation of those who'd learned the world was not to be trusted. No words, no names, Not even a whispered syllable. They didn't flinch at needles or react to the stethoscope. Only their eyes moved, watching, tracking, always aware of where the others were. It unnerved the staff. Dr. Hartman, the attending physician, had whispered to Nathan, "They're not just scared. They've been trained to vanish. No identification, no birth certificates, no records in any database, at least not yet." Their clothes were threadbare, mismatched, hand-stitched in places with no manufacturer tags. The eldest girl, who might have been 9, positioned herself at the edge of the group like a shield, her arms loosely draped around the younger 3. When social workers entered, she stared at them without blinking, as if memorizing every move, silently weighing threat versus safety. Nathan had filled out the initial intake forms because someone had to. Under guardian, he had hesitated, then scribbled his name with a shaking hand. Not father, not relative, just the man who found them. He wasn't sure why he stayed. Maybe because leaving felt like betrayal, like walking out on Grace and Lily all over again. Maybe because the oldest girl had looked at him just once and something in her gaze asked a question he didn't yet know how to answer. The nurses whispered about trauma, the likelihood of prolonged abuse or isolation. One mentioned a cult, another a trafficking ring, but all Nathan could think was what happened to them that made silence safer than speech. The suspicion began quietly, almost invisibly, like a shift in temperature Nathan couldn't name at first. One moment he was the man who brought in 4 freezing, silent girls and sat beside them through medical exams. The next he became the subject of quiet stares, hushed conversations, and clipped tones. It started when the social worker arrived, Lauren McKenna, mid-30s, efficient clipboard in hand, and eyes that scanned Nathan like a scanner set to detect lies. She didn't accuse him outright, not then. But the questions were edged with ice. How long have you known the children? Do you have any photographs with them? What made you stop at that park bench tonight? Nathan answered honestly, calmly at first. He told her he had come back to town to sell his old house, that he had seen the girls sitting alone in the cold, and that he couldn't just walk away. But with every answer her pen moved slower, her silence deepened. So you took them here. Alone. Without calling emergency services, she asked, voice low but sharp. I drove them. I didn't think he started, but her raised brow sliced through his sentence. Most people would have called the police. That's when he realized she didn't see him as a rescuer. She saw a man with wealth, opportunity, and no familial ties to the children in his care. A man with motive, perhaps. The girls' silence didn't help. They wouldn't speak, wouldn't nod, wouldn't even glance toward him with recognition. To McKenna, that was all she needed. Until we can verify their identities and yours, she said briskly, you're to remain outside the pediatric unit. You may not engage with the children unless supervised. Nathan opened his mouth, but the steel in her tone closed the conversation. The doors clicked behind her. For the second time that night, Nathan sat alone, stunned by how quickly compassion had been recast as suspicion, and how saving someone could look to the wrong eyes like something else entirely. Nathan sat in the windowless room, the walls painted a sterile beige that seemed designed to dull the senses. Across from him sat Detective Clara Hastings, a woman with a tired face and sharp eyes, and beside her the ever-present Lauren McKenna, flipping through forms in her folder like someone searching for a lie tucked between lines. A tape recorder clicked on, and Clara leaned forward, hands clasped, voice calm but firm. State your name for the record. Nathan did. And your reason for being in Briar Hollow. He explained again how he'd returned to sell the old house on Ridgeview Lane, how he didn't plan to stay, how he had no connection to the children. The same story now, under oath, under scrutiny. You say you found the girls on a park bench. Alone, Clara said, eyes narrowing. What time was this? Around 7:30, Nathan replied, the words coming slower now. It was snowing. I was walking back from the house, cutting through the park. Why not call 911? I didn't think they'd wait. They looked like they'd run if I moved too fast. I didn't want to scare them more. So, you brought them here in your vehicle, your SUV. Alone? Yes. Clara glanced at McKenna. Did any of them speak to you? Indicate they knew you? Nathan hesitated. No. They just followed when I opened the door, like they were too tired to decide. The pen in McKenna's hand stopped. She looked up. "Mr. Brooks, do you have any history with minors? Any past investigations?" "What? No, I've never. Any psychiatric episodes? Prescription medication? I lost my wife and daughter 2 years ago." Nathan said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I came here to say goodbye." A silence fell over the room, thick and awkward. Clara reached for the pause button on the recorder, then said quieter, "We're not accusing you, but we need to be thorough. The girl's safety comes first." Nathan nodded, but inside he felt the cold rising again, not from winter, but from doubt. From a system that saw ghosts where he had only seen 4 little girls who needed someone to stop. The breakthrough came not through words, but through color. Late the next morning, as snow continued to fall outside the hospital windows and the questions surrounding the girls remained unanswered, a nurse named Maggie entered the observation room to find Ava, the eldest of the 4, sitting cross-legged on the floor, a crayon clutched tightly in her hand. The hospital had given them a few supplies to pass the time, paper crayons, juice boxes no one had touched. Until now. Ava's silence had been impenetrable. Her eyes guarded, her body curled like she was still trying to disappear. But something had shifted. Slowly, carefully, Maggie sat a few feet away and said nothing, allowing the stillness to breathe. Ava continued drawing, pressing the crayon down, harder than necessary, as if she needed the image to hold her together. When she finally stood and walked to the nurse's desk, her small hand trembled slightly as she handed over the paper. Maggie glanced down and froze. It wasn't a child's scribble. It was a sketch, rough but unmistakable, a man with tired eyes wearing a winter coat standing beside a park bench. His hands were extended slightly, palms up, and behind him 4 small figures huddled together. One of them, Ava herself it seemed, was reaching forward. Nathan, Maggie whispered, recognizing him instantly. She turned to the security guard at the desk. "We need to show this to the social worker. Now." Within the hour, the sketch was on the table in front of Lauren McKenna and Detective Hastings. McKenna studied it silently, jaw tight, her fingers tightening on her pen. "She drew him," Maggie said quietly. The girls didn't follow a stranger. They followed someone they remembered, someone who reached out. Hastings didn't speak for a long time. Then she leaned back and said, "Get Brooks back in here." And for the first time since Nathan had stumbled into this nightmare, the ice around his intentions began to melt, not with explanations, but with the silent truth of a child's drawing that said without words, he had been the one who stayed. Nathan sat at the edge of the polished conference table, the weight of every sleepless hour hanging in his shoulders, his hands clasped in front of him like a man trying not to beg. Across from him, Lauren McKenna kept her expression even professional, a pad of paper in front of her, with tidy notes scrawled in blue ink. Beside her was Cheryl Dawson, head of Child Protective Services for Briar Hollow County, an older woman with silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a quiet patience that did little to soften her final decision. "Mr. Brooks," she said after a pause, long enough to feel final, "we appreciate your concern for the girls. But temporary custody, even under emergency care, is not an option at this time." Nathan leaned forward slightly. "They know me. Ava drew me. They trust me." Cheryl nodded gently. "And that matters. But it's not enough. You are unmarried. You have no previous fostering experience. You currently have no permanent residence in this county. You also do not possess legal guardianship or any document linking you to the children in any way." "I'm not asking for full custody," Nathan said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "Just a few days, until they speak. They don't trust anyone else." "This is not about trust," Lauren said, interjecting. "It's about process, about safety. What if one of them has a medical condition you're unaware of? What if they panic overnight?" "You're alone, Mr. Brooks." Nathan looked between them, the fire in his chest dimming into something heavier. "I'm not trying to play hero. I just couldn't walk away." Cheryl's voice softened slightly. "And maybe that's what makes you a decent man." But this system doesn't run on good intentions alone. The girls will remain in protective care until further notice. You may apply for supervised visitation. Nathan nodded once mechanically standing before they could say anything else. As he stepped out into the cold hallway, the sound of the girls' laughter echoed faintly down the corridor from behind glass. From within walls he couldn't enter. He realized then sometimes love comes too late for permission, but just in time for the fight. Every morning, Nathan Brooks pulled up to the Briar Hollow Child Services Center with a thermos of hot cocoa and a bag slung over his shoulder, the cold wind biting at his coat as if trying to turn him back. But he came anyway every single day, without fail. It started with a simple gesture, a homemade sandwich, some apple slices, and a battered comic book he found in a thrift store bin. The girls didn't speak, not with words, but over time they started to show signs of waiting. Ava would press her nose to the window 10 minutes before he arrived. The youngest, Maisie, would tug at the sleeve of the social worker if Nathan was late. He didn't bring toys, they had enough of those gathering dust on shelves untouched, but instead he brought moments. Crayons and blank paper, a flashlight and shadow puppets. He brought stories, not just comic books, but his own made-up tales about brave raccoons and mysterious forests, and a dog named Marvin, who never stopped looking for his lost boy. The girls listened with wide eyes and slow dawning smiles as if each word chipped away at whatever wall had kept their spirits in hiding. He wasn't allowed past the front visitation room. Rules, forms, guidelines. But he made that small space their world. He brought a tiny Bluetooth speaker and played lullabies in different languages. He learned how to fold origami birds just to see Maisie's fingers twitch with curiosity. He asked nothing in return. No names, no past, no secrets. Just presence. Just today. And slowly they responded. Ava drew more pictures of him, of herself, of all four of them beneath a tree that looked suspiciously like the one in the hospital courtyard. Emma, the second oldest, started to hum when he read aloud. Grace, the quietest, placed a paper heart into his hand one afternoon, cut from the inside flap of a cereal box. They didn't speak, not yet, but they showed him something deeper than words. Recognition. Trust, the kind of slow-burning connection that roots itself silently and won't let go. Nathan went home each night alone, but his heart stayed with them, waiting to return the next morning with something new to give. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of bitter, gray-skied day that clung to the bones and made the whole world feel quiet. Nathan sat in the visitation room, same as always, with his worn thermos of cocoa and a stack of illustrated books beside him. He was in the middle of reading about a fox who couldn't sleep unless he counted the stars, his voice soft. And even when something changed so small, so subtle, he almost missed it. Ava, Emma, and Grace sat as usual, cross-legged and silent, their eyes fixed somewhere between him and nowhere. But Maisie, the youngest, the one who always kept the most distance, slowly scooted an inch closer. He didn't react. He'd learned not to. He turned the page and kept reading, pretending not to notice how she watched him now, not with suspicion, but with something closer to curiosity, maybe even longing. Then, without warning, her little hand, barely the size of a coffee cup, reached out across the worn surface of the play rug. It hovered for a second in the air, uncertain, trembling just slightly, before it came to rest lightly on the back of Nathan's hand. He stopped mid-sentence, heart seizing in his chest, afraid even to breathe. The touch was feather light, not even full contact, more like the memory of a touch than a real one, but it was enough. It was everything. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just let it be. Her fingers pressed down a little more firmly for one heartbeat, too, then slowly retreated, disappearing back into her lap like a leaf caught in the wind. But the moment had happened, and in that instant something broke loose in him, something old, and rusted a door he'd sealed shut for years after the loss of his wife and daughter. He felt it creak open, just enough for a single sliver of warmth to shine through. She had touched him, not because she had to, not because anyone told her to, but because she chose to. And that tiny trembling act shattered more barriers than any words could. For the first time since that snowy afternoon in the park, Nathan believed not in fate or miracles, but in the quiet, stubborn power of presence. The room was dimly lit, a soft amber glow from the reading lamp casting long shadows on the walls as the snow fell silently outside. The girls had gathered around the small heater cocooned in the quilts Nathan had brought from his own home, carefully stitched by his late wife, now repurposed into something warm, safe living. They still hadn't said a word, not one name, not one story of where they came from, but their eyes no longer held the empty frost of that first day. Tonight something in the air had shifted. Nathan knelt in front of them, his coat still dusted with snow eyes, weary but unwavering. He didn't try to smile. He'd learned the girls didn't trust forced cheer. He simply spoke, his voice low, steady, breaking through the hush like a lighthouse beam. "You don't have to call me Dad," he said, and his throat tightened around the word as it fell. "You don't even have to talk at all, not if it hurts. I just need you to know this place right here, this warmth, this roof, it's yours. Not borrowed, not temporary. Yours. This is home. You are safe. And you don't owe me anything to stay." He paused, his eyes moving from Ava's cautious gaze to Emma's restless fingers, from Grace's clenched shoulders to Maisie's wide, unblinking stare. "I won't ask you to trust me yet. That's earned. But I will be here every day just the same until maybe one day you believe me." No one answered. But Maisie shuffled closer to the heater, and Emma tucked the quilt more tightly around her sister's feet. Ava blinked down at a sketch she'd been drawing, a crooked little house with 4 tiny stick figures and a tall one in the corner. And Grace, always silent, laid her hand flat against the floor beside his knee, not touching, but near enough. It was enough. Nathan stayed kneeling, snow melting in his hair, not needing thanks or titles. Only this, the knowing that he didn't need to be called their father to fight for them like one. It began with Ava. After weeks of daily visits, quiet moments, and Ava's drawing of Nathan pinned quietly on the hospital wall, the social worker finally relented. Not fully, not with trust, but with weary pragmatism. Ava, the oldest, would be released into Nathan's temporary care under strict conditions, weekly check-ins, home inspections, and no guarantee of permanence. Nathan signed every form with trembling fingers, not from doubt, but from the sheer weight of what it meant. When he brought Ava home that night, the house that had echoed with silence for years felt different. He made no grand speech. Simply warmed soup, laid a thick quilt on the couch, and said, "You can sleep wherever you feel safe." Ava didn't answer, but she didn't cry either. The next morning, she left her drawing book open on the kitchen table. On the page, a second stick figure had joined the house. A week later, Emma came. She was more restless, her eyes darting from corner to corner like she expected someone to snatch her away again. She refused to eat the first night, then devoured toast with jam at 2 a.m. when she thought Nathan was asleep. He wasn't. He just watched from the hallway, letting her believe she was alone. Grace followed silent as always, bringing with her an invisible cloud of questions and hurt. She didn't look Nathan in the eyes for 3 days, then handed him a rock from the yard, smooth oval wrapped in a string. He kept it in his pocket. Last was Maisie, the smallest. She clung to the social worker's coat and screamed when they first brought her, but Nathan didn't reach for her. He simply sat on the porch swing, humming gently. It took 2 hours, but eventually Maisie climbed onto the swing and sat beside him, without a word. By the end of that week, the house was full. Not of noise, not yet, but of presence, of small shoes by the door, of scattered crayons, of 4 quilts now slept in every night. Nathan didn't call it a family, but the girls began to call the house ours, and for him that was more than enough. The house on Maple Hollow Lane had once stood in solemn silence, its wooden floors echoing only the sound of Nathan's solitary footsteps and the low hum of a heater fighting the Kentucky winter. For years, the house had felt like a mausoleum, not to the dead, but to the life that had once been his wife's laugh, the patter of a child's feet that never came the warmth of something hoped for, and then stolen. But now, something was shifting. The change didn't come in a storm. It came in whispers and soft giggles, muffled behind hands in the creak of a stair tread at midnight, when someone tiptoed down for water, but bumped into Nathan waiting with a smile. It came in mismatched socks strewn across the hallway, crayons left uncapped on the kitchen table, and 4 mugs of hot cocoa each, with a different drawing etched in Sharpie, a butterfly, a star, a heart, and a stick figure with wild hair. Ava read aloud in the evenings now, her voice quiet but growing steadier as the others curled around her like kittens near a fire. Emma, always fidgeting, had taken to fixing broken things buttons on coats, the hinge on a cupboard, the torn arm of Nathan's flannel jacket. Grace, silent as falling snow, had begun sketching on napkins and passing them to Nathan like tiny messages: a sunrise, a treehouse, a picture of the house with 4 girls in the window. Maisie, the smallest, whispered questions when no one was looking. Why does toast pop? Do stars make noise? And Nathan always answered like each question was the most important thing he'd heard all day. Laughter didn't burst loudly yet, but it stirred like a cello string warming beneath a careful bow. One night, Nathan stood in the doorway of the living room and saw them, Ava reading Emma, braiding Maisie's hair, Grace drawing with her feet curled beneath her, and he didn't say a word. He just stood there, breathing it in. The warmth, the life, the gentle joy of something broken mending itself thread by thread. The house had not just changed, it had begun to heal. They never called him Nathan, not once. Not Dad, not Mr. Brooks, not even Sir. To the girls, he was simply him or that man, or most often he. He brought soup again. He fixed the door. He's waiting by the porch. At first it stung more than Nathan admitted. After all he had done, every morning trip to the hospital, every silent dinner placed gently on the bedside table, every comic book slipped under their blankets, he was still a stranger. A safe stranger maybe, but a stranger nonetheless. And yet there was something else, something unspoken, flickering beneath their guarded voices and unsaid words. It lived in the way Ava always checked the clock when he was 5 minutes late. It breathed in how Emma kept a list of questions she wanted to ask him, but only when he had time. It lingered in Grace's sketches, where a tall figure began to appear beside the 4 small ones, not touching, just near enough. And Maisie, the smallest, had started to sleep with the jacket he once left on the couch. They didn't say his name, but they knew his footsteps now. They could hear them from down the hall and didn't flinch. They didn't run, didn't hide, didn't close the door. Ava would glance up, Emma would nod, Grace would pause her pencil, and Maisie would tilt her head in his direction and whisper to the air, "He's back." It wasn't affection, not yet, but it was trust. A fragile kind of trust, quiet and fierce, the kind that doesn't bloom with words but with presence. And Nathan, though he longed to hear a name, didn't push. He answered every question, met every gaze, stood in every doorway with his soft smile and tired eyes. He didn't ask to be called anything. He just stayed. And in staying, he became more than a man to them. He became the one who never left, the one who didn't demand, didn't yell, didn't vanish, the one who returned again and again until their eyes, once empty, began to look up at him and hold, not with names, not yet, but with something even deeper, belief. In the warmth of a kitchen that had once only known silence and cold coffee, the scent of cinnamon and roasted apples now floated softly through the air as Nathan leaned over the stove, sleeves rolled, showing Ava how to test if the dough had risen just enough by pressing it gently with 2 fingers. Beside them, Maisie sat on the counter, too small to reach, but too determined to be left out, her hands covered in flour, as she whispered ingredients under her breath, like a sacred spell. In the living room, a needle-pierced cloth in quiet rhythm, Emma, the most guarded now, learning how to mend the torn hem of her coat under Nathan's gentle guidance. His fingers showed her how to thread the needle, how to knot the thread, how not to pull too tight. She said nothing, but her hands stopped trembling, and that was enough. Meanwhile, Grace, ever silent and full of wonder, was working with Nathan on what might have been the strangest Christmas tree Briar Hollow had ever seen. They had no ornaments, no green branches, no tinsel or glitter. But they had books, dozens of old forgotten books from Nathan's attic, stacked carefully into a pyramid of story and memory. Grace's fingers traced each spine, before placing it, choosing titles not by size, but by feeling, until the tree stood nearly 4 feet tall, held together with care and string and something close to magic. Nathan placed an old brass lamp finial on top, It wasn't a star, but Grace smiled anyway. In that house where laughter had once been a foreign language, it now whispered through walls like old friends coming home. The lights were dim, the air cold outside, but inside was firelight bubbling stew, the sound of a sewing needle biting cloth, and the thump of books being stacked not just into a tree, but into something stronger, a ritual of belonging. Each thread, each flower-dusted apron, each crooked stack of Dickens or Austen said what words hadn't yet. We are here. We are building something. We are trying. And it is enough. It was on a Tuesday morning, the kind where the frost still clung to the porch railings like stubborn memories, and the coffee hadn't yet cooled in Nathan's mug, when a black SUV rolled up the gravel driveway with the unsettling precision of something official. The door creaked open and out stepped a man in a dark wool coat, shoulders stiff with purpose and eyes that scanned the modest house like he was measuring what could be taken. Dwight Sullivan didn't knock right away. He stood for a moment, papers in hand, the kind with seals and stamps that smelled of cold ink and government permanence. Nathan opened the door before the knock came, something in his chest tightening, even before a word was spoken. "Mr. Brooks," Dwight asked, voice smooth but sharpened with bureaucratic confidence. "I'm with Child Protective Services. I believe you've been temporarily housing 4 minors." "Yes." Nathan nodded slowly, his eyes flickering to the dining room table where breakfast crumbs and mismatched mugs stood as quiet proof of the life inside. Dwight held up a manila envelope. "I have here a court order for immediate removal into state custody." The words dropped like lead. Nathan's mouth opened, but nothing came at first. They're safe here," he finally said, his voice low, almost a plea. Dwight didn't flinch. "That's not for you to decide." Behind him, Grace peeked through the hallway, her small hand clutching the doorframe. She didn't say a word, but Nathan saw it, her face turning pale, her shoulders curling inward like they used to. "At least let them eat," Nathan said, jaw tight. Dwight hesitated, then gave a short nod. 10 minutes. The door shut again, and in that sudden silence, Nathan's hands trembled over the sink. He had built something fragile and real, and now it was being taken with the same casual cruelty that had once broken him. But as he turned back to the kitchen and saw Ava quietly gathering Grace and the others, something shifted. Not rage, not panic, but resolve. This wasn't over. Not yet. Nathan followed Dwight Sullivan outside, the cold wind biting through his sleeves, as they walked toward the SUV where the children huddled silently in the back seat. The manila envelope was still clutched in Dwight's hand, thick with documents that reeked of forgotten hearings and silent rubber stamps. Nathan tried to steady his breath. "You said you were with CPS?" he said, eyes narrowing, "but I don't see your badge." Dwight gave a tight, practiced smile, reaching into his coat to flash an identification card so quickly it barely registered. "I work through a private partner agency," he said. "State contracted. Fully authorized." Nathan frowned, unease prickling his skin. "I've never seen your name on any of their reports." Dwight's smile vanished. "I was registered with the state," he said carefully, almost rehearsed, as a foster care guardian. "A few years ago. That's public record." Nathan didn't move. But not anymore. A pause, then clipped and defensive. There was a misunderstanding, a complaint that was unfounded. The state overreacted, as they often do in high-pressure cases. His tone shifted, eyes sharp. "But I still retain temporary guardianship privileges through a private loophole." Nathan's jaw tightened. "So you were removed from the registry?" Dwight didn't answer immediately. "Technically, yes, but the court never fully stripped my rights. The paperwork is messy." He handed Nathan a sheet, the kind typed with vague phrases and legal murk full of gray space that let men like Dwight slip through unnoticed. Nathan scanned it, heart-pounding, catching words like prior placement terminated pending review and rehabilitative petition denied. Nathan looked up. "Why these girls?" Dwight's face hardened. "That's none of your concern. They're under my legal authority." But Nathan saw it now, how Dwight avoided the girl's eyes, how Ava shrank back when he approached. There was a history here, one scrawled not in court records but in scars and silence. Nathan's voice dropped, slow and deliberate. "You're not taking them." Not until I talk to the county. Dwight's smile returned cold and confident. You have no legal standing, Mr. Brooks, but by all means, try. Then he got in the SUV, started the engine, and pulled away, leaving a storm behind. Dwight Sullivan returned later that week with a calmness that felt calculated. Wearing a smug look and carrying a manila folder thick with papers, he dropped onto Nathan's kitchen table like a gavel falling in court. As of this morning, he announced, the court has reactivated emergency custody protocols. The girls will be reabsorbed into the foster care system immediately pending reassessment of placement. Nathan stood motionless for a second, his breath tight in his chest as if his ribs had locked shut, watching the girls from across the room. Ava frozen by the bookshelf, her arms instinctively outstretched in front of the younger ones, as if shielding them from something she remembered all too well. They're not going anywhere? Nathan said, voice level but cracking under the strain. Dwight's smirk widened. They are wards of the state, Nathan. Not your children. You have no authority, no papers, no rights, just good intentions. But that's not how the system works, and we both know that. He opened the folder and slid out several documents, court stamps, emergency petitions, and what looked like an old adoption file with Ava's name scratched onto the top. Their re-entry has already been processed. You had your little fairy tale moment. It's over now. Step aside and let the law do its job. But Nathan didn't move. He didn't speak right away. Because something deeper had ignited inside him, not rage, but something quieter and more dangerous resolve. They've laughed in this house, he finally said. They've slept through the night. They've eaten without fear. They've drawn pictures. They've spoken. He looked Dwight in the eye. You call it the system, but to them, it's the nightmare. And I will not let you drag them back into it. Ava's voice, hoarse, barely audible, cut through the room then. Please, she whispered not to Dwight but to Nathan. And in that single syllable, every bruise the system had left on her soul screamed through the silence. Nathan stepped in front of her, planting himself like a wall, and spoke again, firm, unflinching. You'll have to go through me. As Dwight reached for the folder again, sliding it into his briefcase with the cold precision of someone who'd done this before, one of the younger girls, Lila, the smallest, barely 7, suddenly staggered back from the group as if the air had been punched out of her. Her knees buckled, and with a soft thud that no one seemed to hear, she crumpled to the hardwood floor, her tiny hands clenched at her sides, her chest heaving. Then, out of her throat came a sound so raw, so cracked and primal, it sliced through the room like a siren only meant for one set of ears. No! She screamed, her voice laced with terror and fury, her eyes wide with something deeper than fear memory. No, no, please. She sobbed louder now, as if trying to stop time itself from moving forward. But in the flurry of adult conversation, of legal terms and paper shuffling, no one turned, no one except Nathan. He was already moving before her second scream shattered the air. He reached her just as she collapsed again, trembling, her breath coming in panicked bursts. He knelt and scooped her into his arms, whispering words he hadn't prepared, but that came from someplace truer than instinct. It's okay. I hear you. I hear you, Lila. I'm right here. She clung to him like a life raft, sobs still tearing from her throat, her fingers gripping the fabric of his coat with the desperation of someone who knew that monsters didn't always wear masks. They sometimes wore ties and carried papers. Dwight continued, speaking, his voice muffled beneath the pounding of Lila's cries, but Nathan didn't hear a word. His focus was entirely on the trembling child in his arms, on the sheer weight of her terror, on the unbearable truth that in a room full of adults with power, only one person truly heard her scream. And in that moment, Nathan knew this was no longer about guardianship or papers or processes. It was war, and he was the only soldier standing between innocence and the system that had already tried to erase it once before. The knock came early, just after sunrise, when the light outside was still dim, and the frost clung stubbornly to the windows like a warning no one could read in time. Nathan opened the door to find 2 uniformed officers and a woman from Child Services, standing silently, their expressions unreadable, their presence like a verdict already rendered. He didn't have time to speak before they stepped forward and read a name from the clipboard. Sophie, and suddenly everything moved too fast. The little girl barely ate, with the quiet eyes and the mismatched socks she always insisted on wearing, was still brushing her teeth when they entered. She didn't understand. None of them did. Nathan tried to speak, tried to reason, to ask what had changed, what new ruling had been passed without warning or appeal. But the woman kept referring to temporary placement, to regulatory compliance, and Nathan's words dissolved under the weight of bureaucracy. "You said we had time," he whispered, his voice cracking. But the woman didn't flinch. Sophie stood frozen in the hallway, her toothbrush still in her hand, until one of the officers gently nudged her shoulder. Then something inside Nathan snapped. He crossed the room in 3 strides, kneeling beside her, his voice soft but urgent. "It's going to be okay, I promise. I'm going to fix this." But even as he spoke, he knew the words meant nothing without power, and right now, he had none. Sophie looked at him, really looked, and for a split second, he saw something break behind her eyes. The fragile trust they'd worked so hard to build, beginning to splinter under the weight of betrayal she didn't have the vocabulary to name. When the door closed behind her and the sound of the government-issued sedan faded into the winter morning, Nathan stood motionless in the entryway, his heart pounding like it had been ripped from his chest and left on the floor. The house felt hollow, as if someone had punched a hole straight through its center. The other girls sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide, their bodies tense with a fear that had returned like an old ghost. Nathan leaned against the wall, breath-shallow panic building in his throat like a rising tide. He didn't know who had signed the order. He didn't know where Sophie was being taken. All he knew was that she was gone, and he had no idea how to bring her back. Nathan had always thought of himself as rational, the kind of man who weighed consequences, who didn't act on impulse, but that night something inside him broke open. After Sophie was taken, sleep became a stranger, and logic was just a flickering candle in a storm of helpless rage. He began packing quietly after midnight, stuffing clothes, passports, emergency cash into an old duffel bag, his hands trembling with urgency and disbelief. The girls were asleep, or at least pretending to be. He couldn't look at them. He couldn't bear the idea of losing another one. His plan wasn't perfect, it wasn't even smart, but it felt necessary. Get in the truck, take the girls, disappear. Maybe to a border town. Maybe farther. He didn't know. He just knew the system had failed them and no one else was coming to fix it. But just as he zipped the bag shut, ready to move like a ghost through a world that didn't want them, the door creaked open behind him, and a voice cut through the silence, not pleading, not panicked, but calm and firm like a hand on his shoulder in the middle of a storm. "If you leave tonight, you lose them forever." He turned to see a woman standing in the hallway, short black hair, sharp eyes, a thick leather briefcase in one hand. Maya Hernandez. He remembered her name from a voicemail he hadn't returned, a pro bono child advocacy attorney who'd heard about the case through a friend. She didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped inside, closed the door, and faced him like someone who had stared down broken men before. "You run, and they label you unstable, kidnapper, dangerous. You'll never get custody. Not now, not ever." Nathan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Maya saw the duffel bag, saw the desperation, saw the man drowning in guilt and love and panic. "I know it feels like the walls are closing in," she said softer now, "but I've pulled kids back from worse. I've seen systems bend when someone refuses to run." Nathan clenched his jaw, his fingers still wrapped around the bag handle, like it was the only anchor left. "They took her," he whispered. "They'll take the others next." Maya stepped closer, held his gaze. "Then let's make damn sure they can't. But we fight with law, not fear." Something in her tone, steady, grounded, fierce, broke through the fog. And in that moment, Nathan realized that staying might be the bravest thing he could do. Nathan stood frozen in the middle of the room, the duffel bag still clenched in his fist like a last defense. His breath, ragged eyes darting between the door and the children's dimly lit hallway behind him. Maya didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words were sharp enough to slice through panic, yet soft enough to plant something deeper conviction. "If you run, Nathan, you lose," she said, walking slowly toward him, her heels silent on the worn wooden floor. Not just in court, Not just on paper. You lose something bigger. You lose the only chance these kids have to believe in people again. Nathan looked down, jaw tight, but Maya kept going. You think they don't know you're packing. You think they don't hear the zipper, the pacing, the quiet panic. You think they haven't heard footsteps like that before from people who promised they'd stay but didn't. He flinched. Not because her words were cruel, but because they were true. She stopped just a foot away from him, her eyes unwavering. You can leave tonight, and maybe for a week, a month, you'll all be together. You'll feel free. But they will grow up learning that love is something that gets packed in a bag and driven away in the dark. Or she paused, her voice dipping lower. You stay. You let me fight with you. You face the system ugly as it is. And those kids will learn something else entirely. That love holds its ground. That not everyone leaves. That trust is still possible. Nathan's grip on the bag loosened slightly. Maya took another step, her tone fierce, now fierce but tender. They don't need you to be perfect. They don't even need you to win tomorrow. But they need you to stay standing. Because if you run, you confirm everything they already fear about adults. But if you stay even when it's hard, you teach them to believe in people again. That someone can see them, choose them, and not walk away. Nathan's throat tightened, something cracking open deep inside him. Not guilt, not fear, but the weight of responsibility worn not as a burden, but as a choice. He let the duffel fall to the floor, and in the silence that followed, Maya nodded, not with victory, but with respect, the kind reserved for those who choose to stay. In the courtroom, thick with silence and fluorescent light, Dwight Sullivan took the stand with a carefully constructed air of concern and credibility. Dressed in a crisp navy suit, hair meticulously combed, voice measured with just enough tremble to seem sincere, he began to reshape the narrative into a sinister reflection of itself. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He played the victim, the concerned former guardian merely stepping in to correct a dangerous situation. Mr. Nathan Carter, he said slowly, turning to glance briefly at the man sitting across the aisle, is a man with no spouse, no legal background in childcare, no previous relationships to these children. He has no official documentation connecting him to them. And yet he inserted himself into their lives, visited them daily, brought them gifts, sweets, comic books, anything to win their favor. His lawyer interjected with just the right questions, giving Dwight space to continue painting the portrait of a reclusive, emotionally unstable man using affection as leverage. He lives alone in a house with a history of isolation. Neighbors never see him speak to anyone, and now suddenly he wishes to care for multiple vulnerable children with no oversight. The jury listened in unsettling stillness. Dwight's tone turned softer, laced with faux compassion. I understand how these children, already traumatized, could mistake Mr. Carter's attention for safety. But we must ask ourselves, what kind of man appears out of nowhere without training or accountability, and convinces children to trust him over the system? The room shifted. Even a few social workers narrowed their eyes. Nathan sat still, jaw-clenched, fists closed tight in his lap, as Maya scribbled notes beside him, her expression a mix of rage and calculation. Dwight concluded with practiced gravity. This is not about punishing a man. It's about protecting children from yet another unqualified adult with a savior complex, whose lonely existence makes him susceptible to attachment and to manipulation. This court has a duty to place these children back into a vetted system, not in the hands of a man who simply decided he wanted them. The courtroom held its breath as the judge gently called upon the children to speak, but none of them lifted their heads. Ava sat motionless in the witness chair, her small hands folded tightly in her lap, Knuckles' white eyes fixed on the scratched floor tiles beneath her feet. Her mouth was shut, not in defiance, but in something heavier. Something shaped like fear and memory, and the dull ache of being asked once again to explain a life no one had protected. One by one, the others were called Liam, Jonah, Sophie, but none of them spoke. Each walked slowly to the stand, feet dragging just slightly, backs curved inward like shields. They sat down, glanced quickly at Nathan, who sat still, shoulders hunched, but gaze steady, and then turned their eyes to the wall, the table, the floor, anywhere, but the people waiting for them to speak. A silence spread across the courtroom, thick and uneasy. It was not the silence of confusion or shyness. It was the silence of children who had learned that words, when spoken in rooms like these, were often twisted into something else. Who knew that adults could listen without hearing, nod without understanding? It was the silence of memory of days in cold basements, nights curled up in closets, hands that struck instead of soothed, systems that moved them like property, and adults like Dwight who had once smiled with paperwork in hand and then locked doors behind them. Now, with the weight of all eyes on them and Dwight's voice echoing in the corners of the room, they chose silence not because they had nothing to say, but because saying anything felt like betrayal. And yet, in that courtroom, filled with legal terminology, posture, and rules, their silence said more than any statement ever could. They did not weep. They did not scream. They did not defend Nathan. But they did not accuse him either. They simply bowed their heads as one, and in that motion, as quiet as snowfall, they told the truth. The room was breathless as the judge leaned forward, his fingers-laced eyes scanning the silence that still lingered like a fog over the courtroom. The prosecution had finished Dwight's voice, still echoing faintly with polished lies and twisted half-truths, painting Nathan as a manipulative loner who had inserted himself into the children's lives for some hidden personal void. The defense had rested short and quiet, anchored mostly in Maya Hernandez's impassioned but restrained statements built more on presence than proof, on character, more than credentials. And now, the children's silence hung between it all, not a refusal, but a memory, unspoken, yet thunderous. The judge adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and reached for the papers in front of him. Every motion seemed to stretch time, and for Nathan it felt like standing on the edge of something irreversible. His hands were steady on the bench before him, but his mind spun through every moment since the fire, every whispered laugh at the breakfast table, every small hand that had once trembled and later reached for his. Maya sat beside him, her expression unreadable, but her knee slightly leaned toward his, a silent anchor. The social worker behind them shifted nervously. Dwight, smug in his seat, smirked faintly, already preparing his next press quote. Nathan's heart thudded with quiet desperation, not for himself, but for them, for Ava and her careful drawings, for Jonah, who had finally started to sleep through the night, for Liam, who had begun humming while brushing his teeth, for the book tree in their living room, for the way they now placed their shoes by the door in a row as if expecting to come back. And as the judge's lips parted, as his voice began to form syllables that could rewrite everything, time seemed to collapse into a single breath. One word now had the power to either destroy what had been painstakingly built from ash and silence, or protect it. Just as the judge's mouth began to form the ruling, a small rustling sound cut through the stillness, a hesitant movement so fragile it barely registered. All eyes turned as Riley, the youngest of the children, slowly pushed back her chair. Her knees trembled. Her hands clutched the hem of her sweater so tightly her knuckles turned white. She glanced at Nathan, then the judge, then Dwight, who narrowed his eyes as if her mere existence was an inconvenience. For a heartbeat she seemed frozen, but then she took a step forward, then another, her shoes softly tapping against the floor as she approached the front of the courtroom. Her lower lip quivered, her breath hitched. The bailiff moved slightly as if to stop her, but the judge lifted a hand signaling silence. All the arguments, the exhibits, the polished lies and the tired truths, all of it fell away. What remained was a little girl, maybe 7 or 8, her voice barely louder than a whisper, but carrying the weight of everything that had not been said. She stopped close enough that Nathan could see the faint tear streak clinging to her cheek. Her body shook as she looked up toward the bench, then turned to the audience, her gaze sweeping over the room like she was trying to find something solid in a sea of disbelief. And then, with her hands trembling at her sides and her voice breaking into a dozen shards, she said it. "That's my dad." The courtroom gasped a collective intake of air as if the truth had shattered glass. Dwight stiffened, his smirk erased in an instant. Maya pressed her hand to her mouth. Nathan blinked, unable to breathe. Riley looked down her face, flushing with effort and fear, but her voice, though fragile, didn't falter again. "He reads to us. He makes pancakes. He fixes the buttons on my bear. He waits outside school. I know what a dad feels like. He's mine. In that moment, no lawyer, no document, no system could deny the clarity of what love had built. The courtroom had barely recovered from Riley's trembling declaration when Maya Hernandez, calm but burning with quiet fury, stood up and requested permission to submit new evidence. The judge, startled by the sudden shift in tone, glanced over her glasses and nodded cautiously. Maya walked to the bench with the kind of measured confidence that came not from arrogance, but from knowing. Knowing the truth she held was more powerful than any accusation Dwight had so far weaponized. She handed over a flash drive and a printed transcript, her voice. Even this video was taken 2 years ago in an intake room at St. Bellamy Medical Center. It was recorded without Dwight Sullivan's knowledge by a nurse who has since filed for whistleblower protection. The screen flickered on. Grainy, low-resolution footage filled the monitor, but the sound was unmistakable. Dwight stood in a small room with a man in scrubs holding a clipboard. No paperwork, no trail. Dwight's voice crackled through the speakers. "Just get the boy to the van by midnight. The buyers are waiting." "We'll say he ran." A murmur broke across the courtroom like a rising storm. Maya didn't flinch. She let the moment breathe. Then she added, "The nurse in that video is here today, ready to testify. Her name is Clara Jennings. She was threatened, demoted, and eventually forced to resign when she refused to look away." Clara stood quietly from the back of the room, eyes down, hands folded in front of her. She wasn't a woman of power, but her truth was enough to fracture everything Dwight had built. "He called it placement," she said softly when asked to speak. "But he sold children, at least 3 that I know of. Always the quiet ones, the ones with no family coming." Dwight went pale. His attorney objected heatedly, desperately, but the judge held up a hand. "I'll allow it." Maya stepped forward again, voice unwavering. "This man is not just unfit to take children. He is a predator cloaked in bureaucracy. While my client, Mr. Whitmore, brought food, warmth, presents, Dwight Sullivan brokered flesh behind closed doors. There was no dramatic music, no need for theatrics. Just silence, stunned and heavy, as the truth finally found its place in the room. And for the first time, the judge leaned forward, not toward Dwight, but toward Maya, and asked Ms. Hernandez, "Do you have more?" Nathan didn't speak. He didn't stand up to defend himself or try to counter the images, the accusations, the swirling chaos now unraveling around Dwight Sullivan. The courtroom had descended into whispers, gasps, a kind of collective holding of breath, but Nathan stayed still. He didn't need to perform. He wasn't there to win. He was there for them. His eyes, quiet and unwavering, searched only for the children. Not the judge, not Maya, not the reporters, furiously scribbling in the back row. Just the small row of seats to his left, where Riley sat hunched with her hands in her lap, where Ava blinked back tears. She didn't understand where Jonah twisted the sleeve of his shirt so tightly it nearly tore, and where Leo, the one who still hadn't spoken aloud in months, leaned just barely toward the man they still called him. Nathan knew this moment was not his to claim. No court ruling, no legal brief, no brilliant argument could decide what mattered most. Love wasn't awarded, it was chosen. And so he did the only thing he could. He waited. Not with expectation, but with the quiet ache of someone who had nothing to offer but presence. His hands rested on his knees. His body, though tense, remained open. His eyes said what his mouth did not, "I'm here. I'm not leaving. But it's your choice now." Riley looked at him first, her lips pressed into a trembling line. She reached across to Ava and held her hand, but she didn't speak again. Not yet. Jonah kept his eyes down. He was angry, confused, protective. Nathan felt that respected it. He didn't flinch. Leo glanced up just once, long enough for their eyes to meet. And then the smallest thing happened. Leo nodded. Just once, barely more than a breath. But it was real. It was consent. And it was enough. Nathan didn't cry. He just closed his eyes for a moment, long enough to let the weight of that single gesture land inside his chest like something sacred. The courtroom saw only silence. But inside that silence, a decision had been made not by a judge, not by a lawyer, but by a child who had learned that trust is built not by words, but by someone who stays. The judge's gavel hovered mid-air, suspended not by hesitation, but by gravity itself, as if the room had collectively stopped breathing. Then, in a voice both steady and unshakably clear, she spoke. This court hereby grants full and permanent guardianship of the minors, Riley, Ava, Jonah, and Leo, to Mr. Nathan Carter, effective immediately. The finality of the words rang like church bells through the room, slicing through the haze of doubt, fear, and manipulation that had hovered for days. No one moved at first. Even Nathan seemed stunned, his breath catching in his throat. The judge continued, her voice now sharpened with something colder, something resembling justice long overdue. Furthermore, based on new evidence provided by the defense, this court is formally requesting a federal investigation into Mr. Dwight Sullivan and his prior involvement with child placement services. The Department of Child Welfare and the State Licensing Board are to be notified within the hour. The air cracked with a tension finally breaking. Dwight's face turned a sickly gray, his mouth parting as if to protest, but no sound came. He looked not at the judge, but toward the back exit where his escape route had quietly evaporated. The video, the nurse's testimony, and Maya's firm, uncompromising voice had done what the children could not be expected to do alone, drag the truth into the light. And now it was undeniable. Nathan turned slowly, not to face Dwight, but to look at the children. Riley's lip quivered, but this time with something that resembled relief. Ava blinked fast, then reached out and clutched the fabric of Nathan's sleeve like a child afraid to believe good news. Jonah, ever the skeptic, exhaled sharply through his nose and muttered something that could have been about time. And Leo stood up, walked to Nathan's side and rested his small, quiet hand on the man's. No words, just presence. It was all they'd ever asked for. Nathan didn't say anything either. He simply closed his eyes for a beat, then opened them again as if seeing color after years of gray. The courtroom buzzed with reaction, but for them, for this fragile, scarred, and now whole family, the only sound that mattered was the silence between them. It was the sound of permanence, of safety, of home. Nathan opened the front door slowly as if trying not to wake a memory. But it wasn't silence that greeted them. It was warmth. The air inside the once cold house felt softer somehow, like it had been waiting just like he had for the sound of small feet returning home. One by one, the children stepped inside. No one said much at first, but there was a reverent kind of stillness to it all, as if they were crossing into something sacred. Nathan had prepared everything before they arrived. Pillows, fluffed jackets on hooks, with their names stitched in thread, a fire whispering low in the hearth. But it was the dining table that held them longest. There were 5 plates, 5 cloth napkins, 5 cups, a roasted chicken, fresh bread, vegetables, and in the center a simple candelabra with 3 flickering candles, their flames dancing quietly, as if in celebration. The children stood awkwardly at first, unsure whether to sit, unsure whether this was real or temporary. Nathan, sensing it, pulled out chairs for each of them without a word. Riley was the first to sit, then Ava. Jonah hesitated, then finally dropped into his chair with a resigned sigh. Leo remained standing a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the candles. Then he sat too quietly, almost ceremonially. Nathan took the last seat. For a moment, no one touched their food. He looked around the table, 4 pairs of eyes glancing back, wary, but present. He didn't offer a prayer or a speech. He just said, "You're home." Then he passed the bread. That broke the spell. Riley reached for vegetables. Ava buttered her roll. Jonah devoured the chicken like it might disappear. And Leo took 1 spoonful of soup and gave a small nod. They didn't talk much, but every clink of fork against plate, every shared glance and flicker of candlelight stitched something back together. Nathan didn't rush it. He watched them carefully, not with expectation, but with a quiet kind of awe. This wasn't the ending. It was the beginning. And in that golden light, with shadows gently dancing on the walls and the sound of children chewing in peace, he realized this was what forever looked like. Not grand or loud or declared. Just a dinner table. Just candles. Just them. Home. They were almost finished with dinner when it happened. Plates half-empty, candlelight flickering gently across the table, the air filled with the soft clinks of silverware and the quiet comfort of shared silence. Nathan was refilling Ava's cup when the smallest voice at the table broke the stillness. Riley, the youngest, barely more than a whisper, asked, "What's your name?" It was so quiet, so unexpectedly innocent that it silenced even the scraping of Jonah's fork. Nathan blinked, his hand frozen mid-pour. He looked up slowly and saw 4 sets of eyes now watching him, not with fear, not with suspicion, but with the kind of cautious curiosity that only comes from children who have learned not to expect answers. Riley's eyes were wide. Her lips slightly parted, her question still suspended in the air like a fragile bird. "What's your name?" she repeated a little louder now. Nathan placed the pitcher down and leaned slightly forward. His voice was steady, but soft. "Nathan," he said simply. He didn't say Mr. Sullivan. He didn't say guardian or temporary placement or legal caretaker. Just Nathan. Riley tilted her head slightly as if testing the shape of the word in her mind. "Nathan," she echoed, drawing out each syllable like it was something she'd never been allowed to hold before. "That's a nice name." Jonah snorted under his breath, but it wasn't mocking. Ava smiled faintly. Leo didn't say anything, but his fork paused mid-air. For a long time they had lived under titles caseworker foster placement system. Now there was a name, and not just a name, but an offering. Riley leaned back in her chair, satisfied with the answer, and resumed nibbling at her roll. But something had shifted. Nathan felt it like a ripple, small but undeniable. For days, weeks, maybe even years, these children had been taught not to ask, not to trust, not to expect consistency. But now a question had been asked, and an answer given without flinching, without condition. Nathan. Just Nathan. And in that moment, beneath the warm wash of candlelight and the quiet hum of a shared meal, he wasn't a stranger anymore. He wasn't that man or the placement or the one they'd send us to. He had a name. And for the first time, someone had asked for it, not to report it or record it, but simply because they wanted to know who he was. There was a stillness in the air that seemed almost sacred, the kind of quiet that follows the end of something painful and the beginning of something holy. The dishes had been cleared. The last drops of candlelight flickered low, and Nathan was gathering up the glasses when Ava spoke. Her voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It was clear, anchored, and filled with a soft certainty that made every other sound in the room stop. "Your dad," she said. "Not like a dad. Not kind of. Just Dad." And Nathan froze. His breath caught mid-motion, and he didn't dare look up right away. It was the kind of word he didn't let himself hope to hear. Not from them. Not from her. For weeks he had moved carefully in their presence, quietly, rebuilding the ruins left by others, never demanding, never asking, only offering meals, warmth, silence, presence. He had taught them how to trust by showing up. But this was different. He looked at her slowly. Ava's eyes were steady, not teary, not soft or trembling, but firm, as though she'd already thought it through, and was simply ready to say what had been growing in her heart. Jonah looked at her sideways, lips parted in surprise. Riley blinked fast, glancing between them, while Leo just kept his eyes down, though his fingers curled slightly at the edges of the napkin in his lap. Nathan didn't speak. He couldn't, not yet. His throat was tight and his heart beat so loud he could barely hear the next few seconds pass. Ava didn't take it back. She didn't look away. "Your dad," she repeated, quieter this time, as if trying on the word again, but finding it still fit. Not because he had earned it on paper, not because a judge had signed something, but because day by day, meal by meal, wound by wound, he had stayed. When others had vanished, he had shown up. When they pushed, he didn't leave. When they cried, he didn't look away. That word dad wasn't a title in that moment. It was a covenant. And as it settled into the room, something in Nathan cracked open. Not loudly, not with a sob. Just a quiet exhale, a slight lowering of his shoulders, and the smallest upward lift of his lips. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say he deserved it. He only whispered, okay, like someone accepting something far too sacred to claim, but too precious to deny. And for the first time, he believed it might be true. Nathan didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The room was still holding the echo of Ava's voice, so small yet so decisive, as if it had shifted the very air. "Your dad," she'd said, and it landed like a stone in a lake, rippling outward, touching everything. But Nathan just smiled. Not a wide, triumphant smile. Not the kind that seeks recognition or applause. It was softer than that. Deeper, like something had finally settled inside him. Something that had long been fractured or hidden, something he never dared ask for, but had quietly, patiently waited for in the quiet hours of broken nights. He smiled, because if he spoke, the weight of his emotion might flood everything. He smiled because sometimes silence is the most honest language when gratitude runs too deep for words. He looked at each of them not with expectation, not with ownership, but with something gentler, a reverence almost like a man being entrusted with something sacred. Ava's face remained steady, but her hands twitched beneath the table, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. Riley had gone very still, her lips slightly parted, as if trying to make sense of the moment that had just unfolded. Jonah, trying not to show he cared, picked at the wax along the base of the candle, but his eyes kept glancing toward Nathan, unsure, cautious. And Leo, the quietest of them all, kept his head low, but Nathan saw the tiny nod, the almost imperceptible dip of the chin that meant he'd heard, that he understood. Nathan's smile held them all. It offered no promises, no explanations, only presence. In that moment, he wasn't a man who had once vanished from his own life. He wasn't a stranger trying to fix what others had broken. He wasn't a rescuer, a savior, or even a guardian. He was simply there, present, solid, chosen. The smile said, "I heard you." The silence said, "I'm staying." And that was enough. The candles flickered low, casting golden halos on their faces, and the clock ticked softly in the background, marking not the end of something, but the very beginning. A dinner with no great feast, no music, no grand words, just light breath, warmth, and the quiet recognition that family once broken had begun to mend, not through declarations or documents, but through a child's brave naming and a father's quiet, unshakable smile. The house smelled of cinnamon and vanilla, the soft crackling of the oven mingling with the sound of laughter that floated through the kitchen and into the living room. Balloons, each one carefully chosen in colors that matched personalities, hovered near the ceiling like curious stars watching over the moment. There was no extravagant catering, no grand venue, no towering cake sculpted by professionals. But there were 4 paper crowns, handmade with glitter glue and markers, sitting on a wooden table that now held 5 plates instead of 1. 5 birthdays, 5 lives, 1 new beginning. It was Zoe who'd said it first weeks ago while brushing cupcake batter off her cheek. "Can we just celebrate all of us at once? Like we were born into this house together." Nathan had paused, then a mixing spoon in one hand, heart briefly arrested by the simplicity of her wish. And now here it was. The first Brooks family birthday. No one spoke the word adoption. No one said foster or system or former ward of the state. Those belonged to another life, one none of them had chosen. Today, they chose this. Skylar lit the candles, fingers slightly trembling, but proud. Ava arranged the cupcakes in a neat circle, insisting the frosting swirls be aligned like the petals of a flower. Riley, usually quiet in group settings, was humming a tune under her breath as she folded napkins into little triangles. And Zoe kept count. She made sure there were 4 candles, 4 forks, 4 cups of lemonade, and 1 extra of everything. For Nathan. "Because he's turning into our dad," she had said with childlike logic, and none of the others had dared challenge it. Nathan watched from the side, a file folder tucked under his arm, heart swelling with something unnameable and vast. That folder didn't hold party games or decorations. It held their future. Legal forms, notarized signatures, court-stamped approvals, the final documents confirming what their hearts already knew. He had spent months gathering it all, making sure every loose end was tied, every old name formally released, every step completed without error or loophole. Inside that folder were 4 certificates of name change, each bearing a new surname: Brooks, Skylar Brooks, Ava Brooks, Riley Brooks, Zoe Brooks. The moment had been quiet, private. Just Nathan and a notary in a downtown office. But the real announcement was saved for today. After the candles were blown out, after 4 wishes floated invisibly into the air, Nathan cleared his throat. The room quieted. "I have a present for each of you," he said, placing 4 sealed envelopes on the table. They hesitated. Riley reached first, then Ava, then Skylar and Zoe. Carefully they opened them, eyes scanning the words slowly, then faster before widening in unison. "This is—" Ava began. Her voice cracked. Skylar looked at Nathan with something like awe. Riley held her document close to her chest, like a treasure. And Zoe, ever the firecracker, stood up on her chair and shouted, "We're Brookses now!" The room erupted. They rushed Nathan, arms thrown around his neck, small bodies pressing against him in a tangle of warmth and disbelief and belonging. For a few long moments, none of them let go. Nathan closed his eyes. He let himself feel it, not as a reward, not as a redemption, but as a beginning. This wasn't about saving anyone. It wasn't about making up for time lost or wrongs committed. It was about showing up every day with open arms and steady hands. "You belong here," he whispered, not loud enough for them to hear, but loud enough for himself. The rest of the afternoon blurred in golden light. They sang songs, made shadow puppets on the wall, tried to guess each other's wishes, and played games that had no rules, but endless laughter. Dinner was a chaotic masterpiece of burned lasagna edges, slightly overcooked garlic bread, and a fruit salad that Zoe insisted needed gummy bears. Skylar wore his paper crown like a general, instructing the others during cleanup. Ava took charge of writing a new Brooks birthday tradition list, which included dance in pajamas and make Dad eat the ugliest cupcake. Riley drew all of them in colored pencil, a family portrait where everyone was holding hands beneath a rainbow, and Zoe kept asking if tomorrow would also be a birthday, just to be sure. As the night settled in and stars peeked through the window, Nathan sat in the old armchair with Zoe curled on his lap, Riley asleep on his shoulder, and Skylar and Ava playing cards on the floor. He looked at the fireplace mantel where 4 name plaques had just been placed: Skylar Brooks, Ava Brooks, Riley Brooks, Zoe Brooks, each carved simply tenderly from wood they'd sanded and painted themselves the weekend before. There were no gold frames, no glitter, just truth, just belonging, just the beginning of forever. Nathan didn't need a plaque for himself. He didn't need a birthday song or a cake. All he needed was this 4 kids who had finally been given permission to stop surviving and start becoming. Not because he saved them, but because they were brave enough to let love in. Because they said yes. Because they chose him back. They sat on the hill behind the house. 5 silhouettes bathed in the golden light of a dying sun, their shadows stretching long across the grass like soft echoes of everything they had endured and everything they had become. The sky was painted in layers of orange and lavender clouds, drifting slowly as if they too were reluctant to say goodbye to the day. No one spoke. Skylar leaned against Nathan's side, quiet but grounded. Ava rested her chin on her knees, eyes locked on the horizon. Riley clutched a small notebook to her chest, the pages filled with sketches of the very scene before them. Zoe sat cross-legged, still unusually, so as if even she understood this moment needed no words. Nathan's arms draped gently around them, not in possession but in presence. And then over the image a voice rose, not Nathan's, not any of the children's exactly, but something deeper, timeless. Family isn't born in a hospital or signed in a courtroom. It's found in the choice to stay. In burnt dinners, whispered goodnights, and the courage to open your arms to the ones no one else saw. He didn't save them. They saved each other. With love. With time. With the quiet, unwavering miracle of presence. The sun dipped lower, but the light somehow stayed. In the end, Nathan didn't win because he had power, money, or connections. He won because he stayed. When everything was falling apart, when the system tried to tear them apart, when fear nearly drove him to run, he chose presence over perfection. And that's the lesson we often forget in real life. You don't have to be the smartest, richest, or most prepared person to make a difference in someone's life. You just have to show up. Every single day, there are children in the world waiting for someone to stay. Waiting not for grand gestures, but for quiet, consistent love. The truth is, healing doesn't happen through rescue. It happens through relationship. And trust doesn't bloom from promises, it grows from presence. Maybe you're not Nathan. Maybe you're not adopting 4 kids. But maybe you're the teacher who notices a student eating alone. The neighbor who offers a meal without asking questions. The friend who checks in even when they don't get a reply. Maybe you're the one who doesn't walk away when it gets hard. That too is a form of saving someone. So if this story touched you, if it made you think of someone who stayed or someone who didn't leave a comment, share your thoughts or your own story. Save this video if it made you feel something real. And don't forget to follow this channel for more stories like this. Stories that remind us what truly matters. Presence, love, and the quiet courage to stay.